I'm Jenna Gent. I am the Executive Vice President of Industry Engagement here at Consumer Brands. That's a fancy way of saying that I oversee membership and recruitment and our partner relationships. Some of those partners are with us on the line today. Our friends at McKinsey have joined us for today's education session about rewiring the consumer enterprise. Obviously, you all are sitting out there in the world in a consumer marketplace that is very complex and getting even more complex. The McKinsey team today is going to give us a view and some practical look at how do you wire your enterprise to be agile and quick and responsive to the changes you're feeling now and the changes you might feel in the future. A little bit of housekeeping. We are, you see us, hopefully, and we don't see you. So that is on purpose to help with bandwidth. We are, however, going to unmute folks as they enter. We want to be able, especially since this may be a little bit of a smaller group, we want to be able to be sure to have conversation on this call. So we're going to unmute you, and you will hear as our friends go through their presentation where there are natural places to have some Q&A, but please be cognizant of background noise there. Obviously, our McKinsey friends they'll be talking about general examples and won't be sharing the names of their specific clients. Just know that as they are going through their presentation, they're not being cagey. They are being professional and appropriate. So finally, I guess I will introduce the folks who you hopefully see on this call. Sean Callahan is a partner in the New Jersey McKinsey office. He specializes in consumer packaged goods and retail. Kate Lloyd George is a partner in McKinsey's consumer and organizational practices. The marriage of those two things is really what we're talking about today. And Rebecca Johnson, who is a senior expert in the San Francisco office. Between them, they bring decades of experience in the consumer space, in the consumer product space. They have a wealth of information to share with us today on this really complex consumer landscape and some practical advice we know on how to make the most of that. So with that, Sean, I think I'm kicking to you to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us, Jenna. We're very excited for the discussion, and it's feels like we're back in COVID days in some ways, doing a webinar with a bunch of anonymous colleagues. But we'll do our best to make this excited. And just to echo what Jenna said, if you guys have comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. The chat sort of drop down, or just kind of raise your hand. We'll do our best to hit them dynamically. I think this would be much more excited to be more of a conversation than us just kind of presenting for the first bit of time. So we'll try to leave some time for Q&A at the beginning, but as I said, please, as you have questions or interesting things throughout, please let us know. So today our thought is to talk through what we're seeing from an operating model standpoint. What are we seeing kind of consumer companies do? And I'll start with this page, which you guys are all living and breathing it. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, but we're at a very interesting time in terms of how organizations and the operating models that support them need to evolve. We're seeing kind of disruptions really kind of come from multiple fronts. We have, more advanced technology coming into the market on a day-to-day basis. Automation and generative AI have been much discussed. Some of the work that our McKinsey Global Institute shows that the consumer sector is actually the number one sector that's going to be impacted by the impact of automation. If you think about the number of colleagues working in frontline sales roles, some of the support areas, some numbers are pretty staggering. Up to 50% of these roles could be kind of, sort of digitized over a 10 to 20 year horizon. So we're seeing tremendous amount of technology disruption. On the other side, as you guys know, and it feels like we're in a major kind of swing back and forth mode right now since COVID, just really kind of a ton of consumer-driven innovation and disruption. So whether it's new generations of consumers who have very different preferences on kind of products, you see the explosion of new brands, shifting channel structures. We always talk about how during COVID, we really saw kind of a decade in a day in terms of the shift to e-commerce and digital channels. Really, we're seeing just a tremendous amount of consumer dynamism. And really the third vector, which we could add to this page, is something around kind of the employee, because I think we're also seeing our employees and our people with different expectations for what being at a corporate organization means for them. Different kind of demands around flexibility, different expectations around development and career pathing that we see. Frankly, more investment in things like associate health and wellness and well-being. And so when you put all this together, we're seeing kind of our organizations that we're working with. We certainly see this at McKinsey, and I'm sure you're feeling it on a day-to-day basis. You're seeing value being impacted in different ways. So there's, the way companies are growing is changing significantly. Massive implications on productivity, and then tremendous implications also in things like supply chain resilience and sustainability. So these forces are coming together, and so I think what we've seen, there's been a playbook for many years of how companies need to evolve and kind of change their operating model. We think what's required to help companies sort of handle and get ahead of some of the elements we just showed on the previous slide is really becoming more of a rewired organization. And we'll go into a little bit more what that exactly means over the course of today. So what we see today, for most companies, we see a lot of priorities. We see priorities everywhere. We see, tremendous amount of priorities and activity driven by top levels of the organization that get multiplied as they translate down to the front line. What I think high-performing companies are doing is fewer and very consumer-backed priorities. And so instead of talking about toolkits and capabilities they're developing, they're talking actually about the outcomes that these things are delivering and how they're supporting kind of growth with consumers on the day-to-day basis. So going from a lot and sort of nebulous to consumer-focused and selective is where we're seeing that evolve. If we go to the next one. What we're seeing also is a lot of companies historically we've seen, very kind of career laddery kind of progression, sometimes a hesitancy to kind of go external with talent. And so as a result, you end up having kind of more of a static organization. Some of our top performers are actually buried, deep into organizations. One of the companies I worked with, we found that the person who was leading their work with the key retailer in the U.S. was actually 4 levels below the CEO, and that was about 30% of top line. And so when you look at that, that's not the right way to think about it. So we're seeing a much more of a holistic focus on talent management, elevating our critical roles to the where the value creation is really occurring. I think we all see, and even as McKinsey, we're guilty of this. We kind of get into box and line mode very easily, and when it comes to thinking about the operating model, and we see structure changes, and we've done some surveys that show that companies reorganize an average of every year and a half in the consumer space, and so you end up being on this pendulum of going back and forth. It feels like a box and line change is going to change it all, and as you guys well know, that rarely is the case, and so. Instead of thinking so much about boxes and lines, our focus is increasingly on how do we actually network our teams to work together to make sure we're breaking down silos. It's really around how do we drive connection, and that's the one thing that we can really do now that didn't exist 5, 10 years ago. Just being on a Zoom call like this, there's new technology, there's new ways of working that we don't have to live in silos. We may have a team working on an innovation in the US, a team working on a similar innovation in Korea, and those teams should be able to talk and work together in a way that wasn't practically possible 10 years ago. And so our when we talk about is the matrix dead, our answer is not really, but it's the network is what we get excited about, is actually how do we draw connections and not focus so much on boxes and lines, but really on working together and ensuring kind of teams are working together across functions and across markets. The fourth element that we're seeing is technology. So I think a lot of, we see a lot of pilot in perpetuity. People are excited about pilots. They spread 1,000, different opportunities. And I think there was a time and space when the technology was a little bit more, a little bit less advanced, where that made a lot of sense. If I think about things like analytics related to revenue growth management, 5-7 years ago, there was a lot of experimentation happening. I think now the technology, the software, the tools, the analytics that support it have become much more advanced. And so we see companies getting stuck in kind of perpetual pilot mode, where the best performing companies are making bets on where they want to scale technology, doing it in a big way, and really driving it through the organization. So it's much more around building with the intent to scale versus piloting for the sake of piloting. Similarly, on data and analytics, I think there's always been this debate. DNA, is this something that we keep centrally, build once, and then deploy, or is it something that we kind of proliferate across the business? I think our answer is much more the latter, that companies need to create a way to make sure people, whether they're kind of working in a factory day to day or whether they're making big brand plans sitting at corporate headquarters, are really armed with the right data and analytics required to make decisions. And so we need to make sure there's a way to sort of democratize the data and analytics and arm people with that. Now, that does require some central capability. If you think about building the tools, if you think about kind of the shared service component of some of these things, things like Nielsen, IRI, those kind of elements are being done in a much more, the syndicated data is being done in a much more cost-effective way centrally. But the value-added analytics is where we want that really kind of in the arms of our colleagues who are on the front line every day. And the last biggest from two is we really, there used to be a notion, or I think we had governance set up high and we had doers kind of down below who were taking orders. And usually when you have a model like that with 4 or 5 layers between people, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation or confusion. And so we've moved away. Companies that we think are the highest performers have moved away from really kind of top-down governance models to really more of a governance structure that allows freedom in a framework. So people clearly understand the boundaries, the guidelines, and frankly, we're liberating more people within an organization to be problem solvers and independent thinkers versus feeling like they're kind of, sort of needing to interpret and act on increasingly inscrutable guidance from governance that's set from up high. So, this is kind of what we're seeing. If I kind of take a summary on the right side, it's around really kind of fewer consumer-backed priorities, holistic approach to talent management, much more of a focus on network than boxes and lines, a really kind of embedding of digital tools and data analytics throughout the organization in the places that drive the most value, and really liberating people to be more problem solvers and independent thinkers within the right governance and frameworks versus very heavy governance structures that many CPG companies have long relied on. So if I had to say what the big idea is, I think I've hit on a lot of the elements to it, but we think what we're quite excited about is we do think this is a new playbook, a new recipe, if you will, for what a high-performing operating model could be. To us, it's not about being on this pendulum of should I globalize or should I localize? Should I scale or should I embed? Should I sort of invest in capabilities or should I focus on driving efficiency? As our consumer practice at McKinsey has recently said, it's a world of ands, not ors. And so I think that the same is true when it comes to the operating model. So the big idea here is finding, really where can we scale successful enterprise-wide innovations using those 6 imperatives that I talked about on the prior slide and which we'll kind of bring to life throughout the course of today. We call this collectively a rewired consumer enterprise. And the companies that are doing this, and our data shows this, companies that are delivering on the promise of what you saw on the prior slide are actually delivering outsized value creation. They're outpacing competitors in terms of value creation and growth. And so we think there's a tremendous value at stake, and we're excited about the opportunity to share that with you guys today. This is a very dramatic page. It shows you how rewired we actually are. I won't hit on too much of these. I think we've hit the big points, but maybe we just kind of let the different elements come up very dramatically around prioritizing around the consumer, upgrading talent holistically, working on a team-based operating model, elevating technology and engineering excellence, and kind of embedding that in the right places. Similarly, having data and analytics kind of embedded in the places that matter in the business. And then I didn't really talk about number 6, but this is really clear. I think this goes around this notion of really wanting independent problem solvers and thinkers. I think that one of the challenges we've seen with many organizations is a proliferation of deep pockets of specialization. When you couple that with a complicated, multi-layered organizational model, there's really been a diffusion of accountability in many organizations. And so we think that by having some of the elements you see up here, kind of rigorous select priorities, simpler structures, more data and analytics at the fingertip, there's an opportunity to drive a culture of significantly more accountability across leaders and consumer organizations. So I think we're going to, if we go to the next page, we're going to spend time today. We're going to hit numbers 1, 2, 3, and 6, I believe. 4 and 5 were covered in a prior session with this group, or probably with not some of the people here, but certainly with CBA. And so we'd be happy to have a conversation on numbers 4 and 5 as is helpful, but we'll spend time today on the other 4. And so with that, let me turn it over to Kate to kind of take it from there.
Thank you, Sean. I guess, so I'm going to start at number 1, but if there is any pressing enthusiasm for any of the others, or are there any questions around what they are, please do raise your hands. But the idea of prioritizing around the consumer for a consumer company should not be that surprising. But we do tend to find that as companies kind of look to optimize and reimagine themselves every 18 months or so, usually as there's a new executive coming in, a new mandate from shareholders, a change in the outside landscape, companies tend not to deprioritize last year's priorities. So we find that actually stressing emphasis on very few priorities that are truly grounded in the consumer versus, say, an investor need or an executive whim tends to be a recipe for success, because they put simplicity at the heart of the organization. And what we mean by that is 3, say, priorities, and only 3, with the idea you can then get your might behind only those 3 and have confidence in taking, say, the hundreds of initiatives that inevitably result from the macro priorities off the table and de-resource them. So that's kind of one area. And then I think the other area within A is kind of making sure that those things are translated into the individual and team goals. We did a survey of kind of like the doers in an organization, so kind of the senior management VP level, about a year or so ago, and we found that kind of 90% of high-performing companies thought that they understood what the company's priorities were. That's not 100. But only 30% thought that those priorities are actually translated into the OKRs, i.e. an individual could tell you exactly how their job contributes to the department's and the goals, and then to the overall North Star of the company. So usually we find there's work to be done there. Kind of related to A is the idea of stopping the low value add stuff, which again sounds incredibly logical and intuitive until you put it in the heartbeat of an organization where everybody and their mother has a new wish list on a given week, and it's very difficult to have the confidence to say, we will do X, and that means we will not do Y anymore. One of the clients that we worked with recently kind of took the A approach, so they decided that they were going to have better coffee beans, say. It wasn't coffee beans, but something else. And as a result of that, one of their large markets found that they were able to stop 300 initiatives. That translates into a lot of resources, which can then be better redeployed elsewhere, including, of course, executive mindshare. So there's that. That also requires kind of a linkage back into talent and incentives around it. So companies that tend to be high performers in this space tend to have some kind of enterprise level lens aligned to the overall North Star, not just I am me doing my job in my swim lane at my level. The final component of this is around kind of putting your money where your priorities are, and then taking resources broader than that. So it's the executive mindshare, it's the capital allocation. We find that whilst companies tend to be quite good at rethinking their strategic priorities, perhaps too many of them, but they do think about what the strategy should be every kind of year, and then the longer range every 3 years or so. Only 8% of CapEx tends to be reallocated as the strategy changes, which means that you're not necessarily directly funding what those priorities are. So again, that's an area that we think there's opportunity. And many companies that we think are winning in this space have kind of restructured their organizations to enable that resource allocation and those priorities. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions, opinions, reactions from the group. Please. Have you guys experimented with any of this at your organizations?
I think we all had done it. The thing is that then the amount of priorities comes back again to be high. So it's something not that you just do once, but something that you need to continue to be doing every 2-3 years to keep pruning the list every time.
Thank you, Francisco. I think that's a really good piece. One client we worked with on this last year found that it was all well and good for the senior leadership who heard it from the CEO's mouth to feel comfortable and to build up the muscle on this. But those who kind of were their direct reports and who inherited the mandate, the confidence of changing, the confidence of staying the course was quite difficult because of, as you say, Francisco, things can kind of creep back. And it can be even, and counterintuitively, I guess the problem can be even more pronounced in a high-performing area of the business that has a lot of talented individuals. Talented people tend to want to over-deliver, which makes it much easier to stick to a world of ands versus choices. One area that we've seen some progress be made is around like forcing guardrails and templates and stuff, i.e. you are only doing this, and almost cutting off resources so that deprioritized initiatives can no longer proceed. Any other reactions? Otherwise, we'll keep moving. I think we've covered. I think we've largely covered this, but it would be like, does anybody in this? Do you guys use North Stars and kind of try to like? And do the stats that we've heard around how they get applied down to individual key results resonate with this group?
We use OKRs, but not necessarily call it North Stars. But yes, we use OKRs. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. Then perhaps let's proceed to the next one, if that's okay. Rebecca, I think we can skip over page 10.
Me. Okay. So the next one that we want to talk through is around talent. Now, obviously, the importance of talent, importance of capabilities, this is not new news. This has always been critical to any good organization and operating model. However, what we're seeing at some of the more kind of growth-oriented companies that are thinking about some of these external forces that Sean was talking about at the beginning, is a lot more intentional strategic moves around understanding really what capability needs your organization needs as it relates to your overall strategy, as well as making sure that you really understand where the highest value roles exist in the organization. As Sean, I think, mentioned one of his examples at the beginning, realizing that while the C-suite and the executives are, of course, very critical, it is likely that there are also highly critical roles that are maybe embedded in other parts of the organization. So understanding that and developing strategies around that is key. So when we talk about talent and sort of this rewired, operating model, the first element is around, understanding those capability needs. Now, there are within the consumer world, there are certainly kind of, I'd call them more table stakes capabilities, the areas you need to be at par. And then there's going to be capabilities where you really want to push to be best in class or next gen. And, maybe that's around RGM, or maybe it's around disruptive innovation. I mean, there's, a myriad of kind of capability areas to double down on. However, obviously organizations can't invest in all of those to be best in class. So being extremely intentional and thoughtful about, when we look at our strategy and our North Star, as Kate had just talked about, and when we've narrowed that down to some discrete North Star priorities, what are really the capability areas that we need and want to be best in class? And where can we be maybe at par? And then tying those capability needs directly to your strategic objectives, adding value to that capability makes it less of we're just going to upskill some talent, we're going to do some trainings. No, it's much more an intentional capability strategy to say, these are our North Star priorities. These are the capabilities we need to be best in class to reach those goals. And therefore, let's develop our talent strategy, whether it's best by, upskilling our existing talent, looking to external talent, leveraging external partners. But it's all tied into actually clear value objectives tied to the overall North Star priorities. And then with that, as part of that, what we're seeing companies do is then looking to this, where are the roles within the organization that do create the most value and drive toward those, again, those North Star priorities. And realizing, as mentioned, it may not be the leaders at the top always. It could be embedded within the org. Identifying and understanding where those roles are and making sure that you've got the right talent in the roles with the right resources is critical to kind of driving your overall talent strategy. And then, with that, on kind of the second point here around the talent proposition, the EVP, obviously employee value propositions, not new. Companies all have them, but particularly in light of some of the things that, Sean discussed early on, obviously what talent is looking for is evolving and changing. We know that. I mean, everything from hybrid versus remote working models, to their expectations of training that they're going to receive, to expectations of their career progressions. Obviously, this changes all the time. So revisiting that, making sure that you've got the right EVP in place that ties in with the capability and talent needs that you've kind of unearthed in and making sure that all ties together. Is something that we're seeing companies start to be more intentional and focused about. I see some. Okay, so a few examples here to kind of point to that I think help bring this to life a little bit, and actually examples of what we've seen clients do in the consumer space specifically. So this kind of brings to life a little bit the example around how do you actually use your strategic pillars and your North Star priorities to inform the real capabilities that you need. So this was a food manufacturing company, and essentially they had their broad strategic plan of 5 pillars, 5 planks, and those, each strategic pillar obviously tied to an expected value. And they went through a pretty robust exercise. This is a simplified version of it, but there's a lot that went underneath each one of these capabilities to actually tie the importance of that capability to realizing each of the pillars and then tying the numerical value to that. And in going through this exercise, they were able to then say, look, we know we don't have the resources to invest in all of these capabilities, but where we're really going to double down on is, let's call it trade and promotion, pricing mix. That is critical to 3 of our pillars. That's got the most value tied to it. Let's, make sure we're bringing in the right talent and upskilling our talent around and making sure they have the right systems and other enablers to make that a reality. So, it's an exercise that really helps, in an ocean of next gen capabilities that everybody's talking about, to how to start to actually focus on the ones that are going to drive the most impact according to your broad North Star strategy. And then the other example that to help bring this to life a bit, again, this is kind of a sanitized of what we've done at actually multiple consumer clients, and is kind of this talent, we call it talent to value approach. I'm sure you've heard it, possibly called other things, but essentially it gets at, companies taking a look at, where do those high value roles sit in the organization? And what we found in our research is usually it's like 30 to 40 critical roles drive 80% of value within an organization. And those roles, as mentioned several times now, may not be at the top, likely are embedded throughout the organization. And when we say a quote critical role, obviously all roles are critical. Every role is critical to delivering, but it's really understanding which are the roles that either have, a very scarce capability, have institutional knowledge, have, a deliverable expectation that is outsized to driving the, your overall value pillar. And going through the process of actually understanding where that talent is helps you then make sure, one, you've got the right talent in those roles. You're thinking about the capabilities that talent needs to continue to upskill themselves and bring you to the next level. You can be a bit more intentional in your high potential talent strategy. All of this can really tie into a broader talent strategy to understand what are those critical roles. And by the way, when I say roles, I don't mean people. I mean really the role itself. I mean, this ties to people, but this is really about looking just at essentially a role description of what this role is doing and the deliverables of that role, and understanding kind of where that value drives. So that's the main piece on talent and kind of capabilities. Any comments? How are you all thinking about
Rebecca, Christian put a question in the chat in case you haven't seen it.
Sorry, I'm presenting. I'm on presenter.
No, I know it's impossible to multitask. You've done it beautifully.
So does this readily lend itself to bottom-up planning? Yes, it does. I'd say that, I'm not sure if this question was more on the talent to value or on the kind of capabilities tied into strategic planning. I'm assuming it's more on the strategic, the previous slide.
It was when you presented the first one.
Okay, I was like, I'm assuming it's the previous slide, but so just on that one, yes, is the short answer. So from a bottom-up planning perspective, this absolutely helps in terms of, understanding where in a world of scarce resources, where you're going to put resources and where you're going to drive kind of, bottom-up investments that'll, drive to some of these broader strategic priorities. Any other comments on talent capabilities on this piece? No, I know we're quiet. All right, we'll go to the next one.
We'll keep marching then. So this one's all, so the idea of a team-based operating model is to move employees beyond boxes and lines. We find that organizations typically having solid line reporting is incredibly helpful, and everybody needs it, and everybody needs to know who they are ultimately accountable to. But many companies kind of bias into that at the expense of collaborating across levels, across functions, across markets. The impact of that tends to be silos, bureaucracy, some level of delay, and usually less optimized outcomes. For example, classic learning is around innovation. Everybody, there are many situations where a market would see a need for, say, a new type of cappuccino, and instead of having the wherewithal to think beyond their lines and boxes and understand whether or not that need is similar in other markets and or being addressed already elsewhere, they tend to look to solve the problem because they experience and they pay for its impact in their own markets, which leads to a whole bunch of wasted resources. So the idea behind a team-based operating model is, number one, you get crystal clear on what is the work to be done and where is it required. So you line up kind of building on the capabilities piece that Rebecca spoke to. And then two, how do you make those lines and boxes significantly more elastic? So how do you build cross-functional teams that are really oriented towards meeting a particular defined business need and delivering greater value? And how do you refocus them, and how do you align the talent around them? And then how do you make sure that those team-based networks are not competing or contradicting to the org chart on a page? So that's the idea. I will go into more detail. The idea around the kind of where what work happens where sounds incredibly logical, and yet Sean will keep me honest, we find that we spend a lot of our time with most companies thinking through quite critically what is the work that each function requires against those North Star capabilities, and where is the best place for it to happen. I'm not sure which organizations the attendees here are coming from, but we tend to find that the larger the company, the more brands and categories and markets it has, the more complexity there is, and the greater number of activity duplication happens at different levels of the organization. Particularly, we tend to find quite thick regional layers, in addition to the market layer, in addition to what happens at the corporate center. And that tends to kind of plug up the organization in a way. So kind of step one to working in a more effective team is to kind of really streamline what is the work required and where does it need to deliver which outcome. Again, pushing kind of decision rights as far down as possible. Once you have that streamlined view, hopefully you can stop a boatload of work in the areas where that work is no longer required, and you have the clean line of sight to how to do it better. And that's where the cross-functional organization comes into play. The most extreme example of cross-functional organization tends to be agile. And we found that 65% of employees say that some type of agile is being mooted at their organization, although only about 10% of consumer companies are actually really pushing it. But even before you go into full agile, there are still ways of setting up teams, say, to drive innovation priorities by picking people out of different markets, different functions, naming the priority, and aligning them with the right incentives to go after that for a defined amount of time. I guess, question to the group: Have your organizations been experimenting with this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would have said like 2 or 3 years ago when we started having these conversations, this sounded like, the way kind of clients would look at me was very incredulous that, this is not the way a matrix consumer goods organization works. This is not the way we can really do it. Like maybe in places like innovation, maybe here and there in parts of marketing. And I think it's an area where we've actually seen quite a bit of movement. It comes back a little bit to what you hear from employees is there's a lot more energy when employees are working in kind of these kind of cross-functional teams, mission-based focus. So I think that's one part of it. Secondly, there's just so much more work that gets done. One of my companies I work with moved to a model like this for their innovation capability. They were able to drive about 28% productivity, while also increasing top line and getting more projects to the funnel than they had in the 5 years combined in the first year since they moved to it. So I think there is a lot of productivity to be unleashed by kind of tapping into the cross-functional magic of many of you. And it's happening more than you think. It's no longer just an experimentation and pilot mode. It's something that companies are doing at scale. There's a Latin American retailer, for instance, that actually rewired its entire organization from the supply chain up to the very top team to operate in these kind of more agile cross-functional ways. Now, it looks very different from the merchandising team to HR, very different kind of way that these cross-functional teams show up, but the principles of capital A agile have been adopted at scale. And so I think this is the future of where organizations are going. And to echo Kate's question, would love to see from people on the call, is this something that you're seeing in a more experimentation, or have you been seeing this scale in any places?
Okay. And thanks, Christian. Noted, not in a meaningful way. And that's similar to what many of my clients are saying.
All right. Okay. So we're actually going to skip to imperative 6, 4 and 5, if you'll recall, are around tech product platform operating models and data and analytics. Critical pieces, of course, to any operating model, but they, as mentioned, they were covered a bit in a CBR session early a month or two ago by a McKinsey team. So we're going to kind of skip them for this purposes, but please do let us know. We do have lots of materials on those topics as well. But for this, we're just going to kind of jump to 6, which is around the culture of ownership and accountability. So, obviously, corporate culture, always been important. Lots of, every company is going to come at this a different way. But what we're seeing around driving a culture with simplicity of decision rights and clear decision rights, this sounds obvious, right? Like that, of course, when all organizations should have that. But what we're finding is that, companies kind of get themselves in situations where the decision maker is not clear, or the decision maker is 4 levels up in the organization from where the work is being done, or there's ambiguity over in these matrixed models. While there's a lot of benefits, it can get confusing on who owns the decision when I've got multiple bosses, if you will. So an intentional focus on re-examining really how to simplify the structure and really drive clear decision rights with clear decision makers, all the way, from the top down to the bottom, and making sure those decision makers, again, tying everything back into that kind of North Star priority and vision, and where are the clear strategic priorities of the company, driving that down to the right decision maker for each decision, given that, is not an easy exercise, but it's a highly worthwhile exercise. And we in the same research that Kate referenced earlier, when we surveyed about 2,000 kind of consumer goods and retail middle managers, we found that 30%, their perspective as a middle management was that 30% of the critical decisions were made several levels above the organization from where the work was being done. Meaning that, you've got these teams that are doing the work, whoever's deciding it several levels up, that disconnect makes, slows things down, makes things not agile, and creates a lot of ambiguity. So while, decision rights and decision clarity as a concept, of course, isn't new, but really actually taking another step back and looking at how can we simplify our structure? How can we just drive decision rights that are clear and close to the work when you can, to really empower those teams? It goes hand in hand with the agile concept that Kate and Sean were just talking about. Agile teams that can work together, make the decisions, and own those decision rights. And having an organization and a culture of an organization that is okay with that is okay with releasing some of the decision rights a bit lower in the organization, driving that kind of mindset from the top down, that you have empowered leaders that are okay to make the decision. I think as part of that, also with decision rights and that sort of simplicity, and we're seeing consumer organizations as they think about how to live into the next model and the next version of the matrix model, or moving into more of this agile model, is that simplicity of decision maker. We worked with a client that really said, look, we want to just empower our BU GMs. That is our mandate, is we want to empower the BU GMs. And they went through all of the decision rights in the work and moved as much as possible in terms of decision rights under that BU GM. So it just made it very clear that yes, they're still being supported by corporate enterprises and corporate COEs, but the decision maker was the BU leader, and that simplicity can then filter down, all the levels of the organization. And then the last, point C, last thing to note on this is driving a culture that it's easy to share and reuse strategies and everything from assets and strategies and ways of working. And this both in global companies that are going to have regions doing innovations over in China and regions doing innovations over here in the US, to even more US based companies that may have different marketing brand teams working on XYZ. Obviously, it's always good to have kind of that best practice sharing and transparency across the organization, but sometimes that's harder to do in practice. And we definitely have talked to many clients that are struggling with, hey, literally, we have innovations that are being done in Europe, and we're having the same innovation being done in the US because we don't have that transparency across our R&D teams, and there's we don't have that culture of really having that best practice sharing. And now there's so many systems and enablers to make those solutions much easier to kind of reuse across the organization. Again, whether it's innovation or marketing, or it could be anything that can be a bit more reused and as we call it, shameless stealing, to share that. And this is something we, frankly, as McKinsey, we struggle with this, and we have to work on this a lot as well, because we've got our counterparts, in Europe and in Asia that are, working on similar problems. So we're always trying to think through ways that we can enable ourselves, both from a systems perspective for transparency and a ways of working perspective. So in terms of just a few little points here, nothing radical on kind of these detailed pages here, but obviously RACIs and versions of RACIs are not new news, but kind of just going back to that, revisiting these and really thinking about how to kind of put that decision making in a single individual, push it down to the org where it makes more sense, enable those more agile teams. And then the last point here is just around how do we actually embed these types of changes and cultural changes throughout the organization, leveraging, change agents and formal networks, informal networks. These are all kind of change management 101 kind of principles. But what we're seeing is in moving to a more empowered organization that feels comfortable making the decisions, is empowered to make the decisions, is clear who the decision maker is. Not only do you need to, crystallize that on paper, but to actually live into the organization to enable that, adopting kind of change management principles with, leveraging the networks, leveraging your change agents to kind of start driving that kind of cultural shift to more, empowered leaders and empowered decision makers is the way to make it stick beyond just, a RACI that's done and then floats into the abyss. So I'll kind of pause there on this sort of culture, decision-making mindset, ownership mindset. Any comments on this one? I know we're quiet. Okay. Right. The decision maker versus advice giver roles. Yeah, sure. Happy to. So this one, this is an example that this is, just a sanitized example that we used with a client. I'm sure you're familiar. There's the RACI teams, and I think there's a DACI variation. This isn't DAIO, so this is a variation of a RACI framework, where it's got, decision maker, the advice giver, informed stakeholders, and owners. So we found that, there's a lot of different flavors of these. So this particular framework really anchors on the clarity of the decision maker, and then the other teams. The advice giver is an SME expertise. They are not the decision maker, though. This decision maker likely should consult with them. Informed stakeholders are just that. They are just notified. They are not. They may help make the decision come to life, but they are not making the decision. And then the owners is really the one that is kind of almost supporting the decision maker, getting all the information that they need, making it clear, making all the trade-offs and implications very clear for the decision maker to then make that final D. So when how we've used this in context is, for example, if I take that example of kind of moving more into an empowered BU or empowered GM. Obviously, there's 1,000 decisions they're going to make every day, but kind of focusing in on what are the key decisions and kind of key processes that are going to change in this model by making a more empowered BU GM, and actually taking those decisions and running them through this model to understand who in the organization kind of plays each of these roles, and then communicating that through the organization so it's very, very clear. All right. Okay. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sean to take us through these last few pieces here.
Great. I think maybe just a couple of closing messages. This is in some ways, as we kind of have reflected on this, one thing is that there's, these are some themes that are probably familiar to different groups here. I think the magic is in actually bringing all the 6 elements together in a holistic way, because they really do feed off each other. That's one kind of major change. I think the second change is, again, moving from kind of pilot and experimentation mode into scaling. And so as we kind of have helped clients move on this model, I think that's been the kind of ethos that we've tried to help bring, is really thinking about how do you do this big and do it interconnected versus try to do it in kind of bits and pieces. So we typically work to do kind of 3 phases. We would do a blueprint where we look across the organization to understand where we are against some of the dimensions we talked about, really set a vision for what the future would be. Then it's really around the detailed design. And again, that goes beyond just kind of the boxes and lines. I think if you just do boxes and lines, you're bound to fail. But it really goes into reworking kind of some of the critical roles and job descriptions. It's into how do we rethink decision rights on some of the key processes. The ones I always see come up are innovation, planning, or kind of the core cross-functional processes that typically need to be overhauled. And so that's really a holistic design, not just the boxes and lines, and then activating is bringing to life. And by the way, many of the organizations we do, there's a capability kind of long-term that kind of monitors how the transition is going, and there's a course correction phase. I think the other thing is being humble enough to know that you're not going to get it right the first time. And so being open to tweaking and optimizing the model. I think that's been really powerful. Some of the companies I've worked with who've gone to kind of fine tune things after the launch. And so that's just kind of a couple points I'd say in terms of how you typically stand up something like this. I think if we go to the next slide, if it's something that's interested for the group on the phone here, we have a few different ways. I mean, first of all, I'm happy to do a good old-fashioned meeting and talk in a little bit more specificity. I know we hit a lot of themes in a pretty rapid-fire manner. Certainly happy to talk in more depth on any one of the areas that would be more exciting, to bring to life some more case examples, things like that. Related to that, we have a series of kind of what we call go-and-sees, some of which are virtual, some of which are in person, where organizations who have been through this journey, some in the consumer sector, some in other sectors, kind of open their doors so you can see what a transformation looks like at the end. Secondly, based on some of the pre-existing toolkits and things that we've developed, there's a pretty easy way where we can get a little bit of a maturity sense of where you are against some of the 6 dimensions. Just from a fact-based perspective, to kind of level set your starting point. How big of a gap is it, or are you actually ahead in certain areas, lagging in others, and how do we look at that holistically? And then thirdly, again, with the right set of leaders in your organization, sometimes we found it helpful to really try to bring to life what these 6 elements would look for in an organization. So it sounds very lofty, a visioning workshop, but the goal really would be to really lay out what a specific vision for your organization could look like against these 6 or 7, 6 areas. And so we'd be happy to do that too, if that would be of interest. So these are just some very tactical ways to take what sounds like probably a bit, sort of, in the clouds and try to hopefully make it very real for you and your organizations. And I would just say thank you. We really appreciate it. You have our emails here. As I said, our doors are open if you have any questions, or it'd be helpful to talk further. And I know we've got a couple minutes left. So if I know we've hit a few questions on the way. If there are more questions, we'd be happy to take them. If not, we're happy to give people a few minutes back too.
I don't know if I don't see any hands, and I don't see anything in the chat. I want to thank you all for joining us. As Sean said, we appreciate your time today. This was really, frankly, fascinating. As many of you on the phone know, I come from McDonald's, and I certainly hear a lot of what you all have presented in some of the things they worked on there. So you are all on the right track in thinking about it, I think. In any case, we will make sure that we get this information out to you all. And I hope that you will reach out to our friends at McKinsey for a drive-by, a drive-through. Obviously, I'm doing that McDonald's thing. But to get more information, to learn more, they clearly are the experts and can be really helpful. So with that, not seeing any more Q&A, I will thank you all. Sean, Kate, Rebecca, thank you all so much. And we will look forward to talking in the future, and we'll share this information.